Well, welcome everyone to our Wednesday webinar series. I'm Catherine Boyle with Key Ministry. And today I'm also joined with Dr. Steve Grcevich, President and Founder of Key Ministry. We're going to be talking about something that is really timely and really important. And we just wanted you, the viewers, and those who follow Key Ministry to really understand where we were coming from with an event that we have that's launching live in about a week and a half. And that event is the Online Pastors Retreat. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to just go to our website. There's a link right at the top on the right that says Online Pastors Retreat. We were just burdened by everything that was going on this year with COVID and then all of the trickle-down effects from that. And so we just really started praying and searching, what could we do to really minister to pastors? So we're going to unpack that a little bit today. And we have two special guests with us who will help explain why they are participating as presenters in the Online Pastors Retreat and why they hope that other ministry leaders will as well. So I'm delighted to have John Meaux, who is with us from Bay Presbyterian Church in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, and Pastor Dylan Dodson from New City Church in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. So welcome to both of you. We're just delighted that you could be with us today.
Looking forward to it. It's great to be a part of what you guys are doing and excited for how it's going to help.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to throw out anybody who's watching online, if you're watching on Facebook, if you're participating in the webinar, and as we go through, feel free to share comments, ask questions, and we'll work those into our conversation, as we're able and as time allows. But, we definitely want you to have that opportunity while we're sharing this important topic today. So, Pastor Dodson, I'm going to pick on you first. So just tell me a little bit about your church and your ministry. Just curious about how 2020 has impacted you personally and the work that you're doing in the Raleigh-Durham area.
Yeah, so we're about 3.5 years old in Raleigh. I grew up in the Raleigh area, which is pretty rare. A lot of people are moving here. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. And so we're really excited. Like all of us, COVID has changed a lot of things for us. It's interesting. We moved into a new building, a new for us building 2 weeks before we had to shut everything down. And we weren't sure how that was it was just great timing. And God's been kind and gracious and people have been generous. And it's actually been a good thing because if we were at our older space, it was really small. We wouldn't have been able to gather like we are now. In North Carolina, we can regather. And so we're doing a lot of things. And, it's interesting when it comes to, mental health and that sort of thing. New City exists in a lot of ways because of my own personal story and journey through difficult times. I grew up in the church, been a follower of Jesus my whole life, obviously grew into that as I got older. Never thought ministry was something I was going to do. Wasn't against it. It just never was a thought of mine through a lot of events, but really centered around my father's suicide when I was 19 is kind of what changed a lot of things for me and a lot of passions for me and things I want to do and pursue. And so out of that, I was a music major at the time at college. I switched to religion and learned a lot, grew a lot, helped plant a church right after we graduated. And then a few years after that, my wife and I, Christina, who were both actually from the Raleigh area originally, we moved back to Raleigh and eventually we started the process of planting New City. And so again, my life has been marked obviously by that, and even my existence and kind of entrance into pursuing ministry was shaped by that. So.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of people, you get passionate about the things that have impacted you personally, and mental health issues are certainly no exception. So, well, thank you for sharing, how you came to be in this place today. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had Pastor Meaux on talking about just a great approach to taking good care of yourself as a pastor. And so Pastor Meaux, if you will, for those who haven't seen that webinar, just share a little bit of your journey to how, you came to be, on staff at Bay Presbyterian in suburban Cleveland and how 2020 has impacted your ministry and your church work at Bay Pres.
Thanks for for letting me be on. I'm a little different than Dylan in our church context. We're a 100-year-old church in this area, diverse in terms of age, very homogenized in terms of race. And so it's a very different context. So I like getting the pastors different context up, and, you know, Riley's fastest growing, Cleveland's kind of established, and it's lost a little bit of in terms of people, but it's context. And mental health, though, is still so important to what's going on currently in COVID. I feel as though the initial wave of COVID back when we were locked down, there was a silence. I don't know, Dr. Grcevich, if you felt that, but there was a silence of where's everybody? Where's this? I thought there'd be a wave of mental health. We have a counseling department here, and we thought we'd be busy, and I'd have some counseling on my own, and we'd be busy. But we didn't really see that. But now recently it's been ticking up quite a bit here in terms of people are just reaching out. I've had some marriages come and they're on the brink, and some people have approached us to get counseling and help throughout the area. So COVID has been very eye-opening for me, I think, in two ways. First, the old, I don't know, Dylan, if you feel this way, the ways that I've learned how to do ministry in gathering folks and getting them together in one-on-one relations, seeing them face to face, they've just been pulled from me. It's almost like the bullet is out of the chamber and I can't shoot that gun, and I'm not used to that, and that makes me very unnerved. I used to try to minister to people, it's not there. And so God is reorienting us in how we're approaching, how we're reaching out, and how we're caring, particularly in the care model, how to care for folks. But secondly, I was thinking through this question, and I thought, but there is an upside to this. And the upside, as I've seen it, is people are becoming at the end of themselves. They're becoming to a place where they need help, and they're reaching out, and they're actually reaching out in the church. We've seen that in our online presence, and we've also seen that in the care department, where people who typically don't come to our church, maybe be unchurched, are absolutely reaching out. So there is a hunger right now, and I see that as an awesome opportunity, even though it's a desperate times for people, and I feel awful for that, but there is a stirring, which is great.
Yeah. So Steve, anything you want to add to either of their comments?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would kind of second like what John had just said, in that, you know, with everything that was out there, I mean, the little bit of stuff that was applicable from like previous pandemics, we had every reason to believe that the floodgates were going to open as soon as all the social distancing and the different restrictions on personal contact came into place. And sort of similar to what he said, we saw a little uptick in our practice. Maybe we were 10% busier than what we would typically be, but it wasn't a huge thing. And I think that there was a part of this where, you know, folks were thinking it's going to be a short-term issue. When we get to summer, everything's going to be okay. You know, stuff will get back to normal. But with the resumption of school and just the fiasco that has turned into in many communities, I think that the reality of what we're dealing with is starting to sink into folks. And I've told the families from our practice that don't expect things to get better this school year. And that the last 2 weeks of August, like normally like this time of year, I would be like laying out next to the swimming pool after the kids have abandoned it, catching up on all of my reading. Because it's, you know, last week of August, first 2 weeks of September, my slowest time of the year. We had more referrals in that 3-week period than we've had at any time in the last 5 years. I mean, so the things have been really busy. And I think the reality for a lot of people that life has changed dramatically. There are family pressures, there are economic pressures, there are all kinds of cultural pressures. And for guys who are on staff at a church, all of this is coming, as I think John was kind of hinting at a time where everything about the way that you do your job has been turned inside out. And I think that the pastors and people in ministry, because we're trained to give and give and give and focus on supporting other people. I mean, you know, if you start taking a look at like stuff that we know out of like psychosomatic medicine and like stress levels and like risk for physical problems and mental health problems, I mean, the stuff that people on staff at churches are dealing with nowadays is just through the roof. And so I think that that's part of why we're stepping out a little bit from like what we typically do as a ministry to put something like this on, because, you know, with the nature of our work, we work with lots and lots of different churches. And I think it was the reality that the caregivers are hurting that led us to recognize that we needed to do something, and that folks who are struggling with these kinds of issues are more likely to recognize and respond to the needs of folks in their congregations and folks in the surrounding communities who are struggling with these kinds of issues.
Well, so each of you have committed to present at the online pastors retreat, and we're so grateful for that. You both have really, just very insightful perspectives on what you're going to be talking about. So, if you could, Dylan, just start us off a little bit about, why did you say yes? Are you seeing in your community that pastors are really struggling, or, what led you to say, yes, I think this is a good thing for me to invest some time into this fall?
It's interesting. I think on the one hand, obviously pastors and people that are caring for others are struggling with all the burdens that they're dealing with. But at the same time, we want to be able to help them well. I have an interesting perspective maybe. So I'm 30. We planted New City Church about 3.5 years ago. And, when I was in college, church planting was the thing. So people ask me, like, why church planting? And I say, I don't know if it was because it was the cool thing to do or what, but for whatever reason, I wanted to do that. But all that to say, with, the kind of the growth of church planting, which is great and all these sort of things, it kind of like the last 10 years, 15 years kind of grew up on seeing people who were leading large churches and were great preachers and were doing all these things. And you don't see emphasized the care, like, being a pastor is not just about gathering a crowd and preaching the most engaging sermon ever. It's about caring for people and loving people well. And I think this pandemic, especially for maybe those who are younger like myself, has really been helpful and encouraging and pushing people to say, how are you like loving people, regardless of your wiring and your giftings? Like, it's not just about, following Jesus, not an intellectual exercise. It requires, everything. And so for me, again, in my story, I'm not very naturally empathetic or sympathetic. I'm not naturally a great counselor, but going through something tragic, like my father's suicide, which was completely, unexpected, and, you wouldn't think, I learned a lot of things. I learned a lot of what worked, what encouraged me and what didn't. And walking through a suicide and a tragedy like that, you have more people who are willing to share their stories of difficulty, because although theirs might be different, it's like, this is someone who suffered. And so through my own journey, and then walking through other people's difficulties and seeing what was helpful for them and for me, what wasn't, that is, for me, what my session is on is helping people walk through tragedy, practical things. Is like, how do you actually do this well? And how do you care for things well? Because although everyone's stories are different, what I found, there are universal things that are helpful and universal things that are not helpful. And a lot of it is counterintuitive. And so, yeah, people are hurting and people need help. And so I think something like this helps people, ministers, pastors, people who are just leading people in any capacity, give them the tools to walk with people who are struggling right now.
So, John, you were gracious to very quickly say yes as well. So what were some of the reasons why you said yes? I know you're relatively new to the Bay Press staff, right?
Yeah, I'm 8 months now, 9 months on the care staff. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, did you see a need either, in the community there, or where you've served previously, to really, to come alongside the pastors who have just had so much to deal with this year? Or, really, what was the impetus for you to say yes?
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how Dylan and Dr. reflect on what I'm about to say, because I'm curious about this as well. So when you initially the pandemic hit and we're kind of isolated and we're doing everything virtual, the staff was the first to get back together. We have a very large staff. A lot of them are part. The staff got together in socially distanced ways, but that was the place we get to see each other, mostly in Zoom, but then we get together and gather. I started to realize, wait a minute here, this is part of the congregational care, is the staff. And what we started to see is this might be, and this is the question I have for you guys. I sometimes feel like caregivers, particularly ministers and pastors, they use an analogy quite a bit, that they're the the football running back, and they just keep going. They just keep going. They just keep going. They'll just get tackled. They get up, keep going. We just got to keep moving, one foot in front of the other. And they don't realize that the things that are happening in this world, the cultural issues, the pandemic, even the election, the stress of having to minister in a different context has put a burden, or at least in a little way has impacted decisions they make in the back of their head, their marriages. It's putting stress on them. I don't think that caregivers are good folks to give grace to themselves. Why am I reacting that way? Maybe because there is so much going on right now that I need to step back and see that. I don't think we do that very well. I don't know if Dylan or you, Doctor, can relate to that or think that's something that is true.
What do you think, Steve?
I think one of the things that happens is that, like, when you're working with a lot of people who are in distress, one of the ways I think that some people cope with it is that in a sense you try to stay busy because it churns up lots of feelings inside. And by being ultra busy, you can distract yourself from the need or the discomfort associated from thinking about your own junk. And secondly, we live in a culture, and this is true in medicine. I think it's also true within the church, where people give you lots of praise for being the person like who's so dedicated that you're working like 60, 70, 80 hours a week selflessly trying to help other people. And so that there's a certain degree of social benefit, encouragement that comes from that. But doing that for too long can get like really dangerous. So that I can relate to John's analogy. I was a running back when I was younger, and I loved getting the ball, especially in the second half. But when I would come home and my mom would see that like I was covered with black and blue marks at the end of the game, she'd be very worried for me.
Right. And so when you do this pastor conference and you're trying to say, hey, pastors, why don't you come to this conference? I think I want to speak to those that think I'm doing okay. I'm all right. I don't know, because I have had the last 6 months of my ministry has been, I've had some mentors, I've to rely on some counselors. I've been finding some things are being unearthed because I do that same thing. I just give me the ball, Steve, and I'll run through it. Go. And so I think my heart for pastors is they would just examine their heart, at least stop for a second to say, all right, maybe John's right. Maybe there's something even in the back of my head that's pushing and the stress. I just want to be there and available. Maybe God will speak to me through this conference.
Yeah. I think too, there's seasons, obviously there's times where you are working more. There's a lot of things going on. Obviously when the pandemic hit, there's a lot of changes the first month. I mean, it was just crazy for a lot of us. Yeah. But now we're 6-7 months in, and not to downplay the stress, the hardness of it all, but some people are talking about, at least in ministry and circles that I've been a part of, how like things are still stressful and they're still overwhelming and they're still working 60 to 70 hours a week. And that's a problem. Like we're 6 or 7 months into this by now. And so if you don't have a new rhythm, if you haven't created a new rhythm, that's not okay. And so I think stuff like this is helpful to say, yes, there's a lot of stress and unknowns early on, and that's to be expected. But if you're still kind of operating the same way you were 6 months ago, that's like hopefully that's an issue that we need to address, instead of saying, well, that's just what life is like as a leader. Yep. It's not sustainable.
That's a good point, Will. Yeah.
Yeah. Just the other day, I read a comment that, we expect seasons. We know that there's going to be change in seasons, but what we've experienced in 2020, we haven't moved into winter. We've moved into an ice age. And so, that's why it's harder for people to deal with, because it's more of a, it's not a chronic or relapsing, remitting sort of thing. It's something that's going on for a long time, and you just kind of can't get away from it. So, I just want to interject here real quick. If you're watching online, if you are on the webinar, please feel free to add a question or a comment in the chat. We'd love to work in your thoughts on this, and we will definitely be sharing this video on all of our platforms after we get it downloaded, after we're finished today. So feel free to share this with your ministry friends, your pastor, if you're not able to, make sure that they're watching right now. So I really appreciate what each of you described as, kind of the perspective that we can take when something is hard. I'm not a guy, but I definitely have that same tendency too. When something is hard, I just want to work super hard and plow through it, but that is not always the best approach. And at some point, you have to slow down and really, just make sure that you're addressing everything that needs to be addressed. So Dylan, if you could give, 2 or 3 reasons why you want, your, people that in ministry to sign up for this retreat, I think, that might be really meaningful for those who are watching or for those ministry friends who see this later.
I'm a big proponent of the fact that ministry doesn't have to be miserable. I think sometimes, pastors get together and there's difficult things as a pastor. There's difficult things in every job though. But it's easy when you get people that are in the same vocation as you to talk about the struggles, whatever. And I just sometimes we get together, it's it's hard, it's busy. And it's it doesn't have to be this way. And not to Jesus juke it or make it hyper spiritual, but John Mark Comer has a great book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And in it, he just talks about the way of Jesus and how it's impossible to read the Gospels and see a man who is busy. And yet in our culture today, busyness, stress, being overwhelmed is a sign of your awesomeness. And I think it's a sign that something's wrong. And again, there are times and there are seasons where there's a lot going on. But I'm not a fan of the word busy. I'm not a fan of being stressed all the time. That means there's a problem. Again, that's not to downplay the difficulties and the hardships that we face. It's hard when you don't know what to do, but you got to make decisions. It's hard when you are bearing the weight and the struggles of so many people in your church. I just tell you personally, this pandemic is financially, a lot of people in our church have lost jobs, have gone unemployed. And my wife, Christina, and I, we've been fine. And so there's been this guilt there that we're actually doing just fine. And yet there's people, so there's definitely hard things, but if you're constantly busy and overwhelmed and stressed, that's a problem. And you don't have to be miserable. Following Jesus does not have to be miserable. And so I think stuff like this is helpful to remind people to work through some of those issues and to know, with that too, for give you an example of what I mean, I think sometimes there's this idea that if you become a pastor, if you're in ministry and you don't retire as a pastor, you failed. Now, of course, moral failure is not good and burnout is not good. But at the end of the day, we're called to love God and love people. And you can do that in a variety of ways. And so there's not a gun to your head that says you have to do this forever. And so all that is say, it doesn't have to be miserable. It doesn't have to be stressful all the time. It doesn't have to be overwhelming all the time. And so but it takes intentionality and being proactive in order to resist that. And so I think conferences like this are helpful for people to check their heart, to remember their mental health, their emotional health is important. And if they're always stressed and overwhelmed, yes, ministry can be hard, but that's not the way of Jesus as we read how he went about his life.
That's excellent.
Yeah, the time that Dylan's talking about that's what we need. The way of Jesus is presence with him. It's understanding. And these conferences, I hope, direct the listener and the participant to understand I'm not alone, but also that same thing Dylan's saying is we need time to reflect on our heart. If this stress and pride of us saying, no, I don't need help is so insidious, we don't even know we have issues in our heart. It takes the Holy Spirit's time and presence with God to do that. And that's what I hope this thing offers, is a time for you to reflect.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what are you guys hearing, when you when you FaceTime or when you run into guys that you knew from the seminary, or guys in other churches in your city? And what are some of the kinds of things that folks who, again, those of us who aren't professional Christians, who are still in the amateur ranks, can be doing to support guys like you and folks who are on staff with you, during a time like this?
Yeah. Again, I think so much of our view on things is shaped by our experience. So in some ways it's easy. I think might be easier for me than for some pastors, for example, to talk about how overwhelm and stress doesn't need to be your everyday life, because at New City, our people have just been super kind and gracious the entire time. I haven't had a single email, conversation, phone call with anybody, text, not one, where someone was like, why are we doing things this way? I can't believe like in a negative way, questioning what we're doing, not one. And on the other hand, I have received people say, hey, we know this pandemic's crazy. Whatever you guys decide, we're good with, and we're going to pray and we're going to support. And so I think it's just helpful to proactively encourage and also at the same time ask questions, but do it in a way that doesn't come across as condescending. So I think it's totally fine and I at our church, like I want people to ask questions. This is if you're a part of New City, this is your church. It's not my church, it's not the staff's church. And so if you have questions about things, like I want people to ask. If you disagree, I want you to feel like you can do that, but it's how you do it that matters. And so I think sometimes we can send a quick email, for example, and say, hey, why is the church doing this? Why are we limiting capacity? Or why aren't we meeting yet? Or why are we doing this? And although your intent might not be negative, but that's how it can come across. And so I think it's just ensuring like there's encouragement and that you're asking because you want, you're on board, not from a negative perspective. I think that's helpful. If that makes sense.
And speaking of that context too, a 3-year-old church that's probably cutting edge, and you have at least a good pastor and a good communicator. So I can see how this could be a very good, successful church that you're doing. When we have a church of 100 years old and they see this is how we do church, this is how we always do church, right. And then now it's COVID. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily get bad. Our people are so gracious and so generous, but I think what happens is they start to feel stressed. They start to feel very isolated. What's going on? Communication is super important right now for this type of season to have people know we're there. And so I think as a leadership team and as a ministry, I think there's always this, are we hitting it right? Are we loving our people well? And it's very hard to know if we are, because it's hard to see, hard to be in relationship with people. So there's this unknown of, am I doing it enough? Lord, is this where you want us to go? Do I need to push further? I'm hearing some things. I think that might just be COVID related and stress. Is that really what is that wisdom? So there's a lot of ambiguity in the pastoral heart. So how would I say it is if the pastors I serve with and others that I don't have a sounding board to walk through this with somebody and feel safe enough to go, I don't know if I'm making the right decision here, and I don't know if this is helpful. I think that's I've been at least personally trying to meet my pastors and ministry leaders a lot more. It's when we can do that as much as I can. So that's what I would say, Steve, for that.
Excellent. Well, just jumping in here, we're about halfway through our time today, so I just want to encourage you, if you've got a comment or a question, definitely take advantage of the comment section on the Facebook live stream or in the chat if you are a webinar participant. So, I think that pastors in particular have a lot of fears around addressing their own mental health needs. I mean, there's legitimate concerns because sometimes when pastors have disclosed that they've had, mental health need, or they've pursued some sort of counseling or treatment, they've been fired. And my sense is that the culture has shifted dramatically away from that kind of perspective on mental health as a whole, but there still are no doubt pockets where, a pastor disclosing that sort of thing just, would not be well received. So what do you say to the pastors who are living with those kinds of fears and that kind of tension in the work that they're doing with their people, but also knowing that they really need to just kind of mentally step away from all of the pressures and focus on what God is saying about taking care of themselves?
I'll go. The talk that I'm giving is trying to get communal-based 5 strategies to help pastors get to a safe place, because there are some times where it's not appropriate to share mental concerns to churchgoers. Maybe there's not the trust there, and I understand that. Maybe your church is very hostile against any type of clinical counseling or that sort of thing. So what I found walk and journey is to try to find those safe places. Really work hard in those safe places that I can be able to share everything I am, open it up to the light. Because when I do that, they are able to, and this has happened the last 6 months, this team of mentors and a counselor and really tight friendships and some prayer team people. I've found that when I'm open to them about decisions I'm making, they actually know me well enough to go, wait, I think that's your baggage speaking. In fact, I had a mentor say that a couple of weeks ago when I shared some stuff I was going to do, some relational conflict I was going to approach. He said, John, that sounds just like your baggage, stuff that you're bringing in from the past. And it blew my mind. The fact that he knew that well enough to admonish me spoke to the fact that I had this connected community. But I, at large, want people to know that I do have some mental health issues. I do see a counselor, and that's a place where I can freely share because I've seen so much help and growth in my ability because of the counseling and because of what I've seen kind of exposed my past and that sort of thing, that I've seen the benefit of it. But to have those team of people around me is so crucial for sure.
Dylan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I talk about ministry having to be stressful and overwhelming. I also reject that it has to be lonely. I think context is different. I mean, there's strengths and advantages of all different types of churches and all different sizes. And so we're a newer church. So a lot of people, obviously, the people that have been here from the beginning, have only been here for 3 years. So there's not as much of like expectation of here's how things are supposed to do and here's how pastor's supposed to behave. So there's more freedom in that. So I don't have a ton of experience to speak to what you should do if you're in a situation where you're an established church or something like that, because that's not my context. But I think it's important to know that you don't have to be lonely. Like John was saying, you can't tell everything to everybody, but you can talk to some people. And I have found that part of the reason that that leaders and people, pastors can be lonely is because, we like to say that we're lonely. So that's like a leadership aspect. It doesn't have to be lonely. But I think part of the reason why we are lonely is because we're just not willing to be vulnerable. So we don't want to talk about to a couple of trusted friends and mentors or whatever, some decisions that we want to make because we don't want them to tell us it's a bad idea. So we just want to do it. And then it doesn't work out. And then we say, well, no one understands because we don't invite anyone in on the process. And so I just think it's really important, especially for pastors, to have friends. Everyone has a different opinion on this. I have a couple of good close friends that part of New City that are not on staff, and I share with them stuff that's going on. I share with them some of my fears and worries and concerns in terms of like, at times like, is the church going to make it? Is this going to happen? Like I wouldn't tell this to everybody, but even some people in the church that are close friends of mine. And then of course I have some friends and pastors that are outside of New City that I can walk through things, especially if it's involving people that I can't talk about with other people in the church because they know them. But just having people that you can be vulnerable with, that I think we're lonely because we're not willing to be vulnerable. And so I think that can be helpful.
So Dylan, I have a question for you. Your background with mental health and your background with your trauma, have you found that in the DNA of your church now? That what are some things you did to? First off, is it in the DNA of your church? Your kind of idea of being open, honest, vulnerable because of your past, and if that's the case, how did you put that into the DNA of your church?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's helpful, at least for our church. I talk about my story a lot. It's not so that's helpful. I suffered from depression after my father passed away. It was situational, not biological or chemical or anything like that. So it's not like an ongoing struggle for me, but I've been there. And so it's helpful to know what it's like. It's helpful to know what it's like to want to take your own life. It's helpful to know that you can really love Jesus and trust him and still want it to be over. And so I think that's helpful for our congregation when they hear me talk about that it's not a weird thing. I mean, Christine and I, we go to marriage counseling like the beginning of the year, like the last 3 or 4 years, not because there's some major problems, but just because we want to be better. We want to make sure we're doing well. And so I think my story makes it easy so I can talk about it and bring it up. But I would say, I think that's hard, but I think if you can be honest, not about all your issues, but talk about counseling in a positive light, talking about being vulnerable in a positive light, talking about the times that you have struggled with your faith, like that it's okay. I think then people are more apt to think, oh, this is normal for me, as opposed to, the traditional stereotypical pastor who doesn't have any problems and doesn't tell anybody when he's struggling. Then if you are finally honest that you're struggling, people are like, what's happening here? Whereas if you can make it a part of your normal thing to talk about your own issues in a healthy way, I think people are more trained, if you will, to hear that this is okay.
And I think it's so when you're talking about your trauma in your past, I have this sense that since you've been through the valley, when you preach on the valley, when you talk about the valley, when you talk about the darkness, even in illustrations on text that you're using, or just preaching, or even just talking, I bet that comes out in you, exudes out of you, that this guy's been here. This guy's been through that, not just your story, but your own heart. And so when you're authentic and people are struggling, they see the grace that you're sharing because you've been through it, and the illustrations and how you're approaching it because you're authentic to yourself and you've been working on it, then I think people will attach to that. They will be moved by that. They will be changed by that. And I think the problem is the pastor who is struggling, who's going through the trauma, who doesn't really know what's going on in their heart, has done I'm just not going to deal with it. When you preach, when you do these things, when you talk about the value, they can sense, like my kids, they can sense my hypocrisy. They go, I don't know if you know what you're talking about, just something subliminally. So I think that's one of the ways I can see in your church, maybe if you're exuding, I've been through the valley and I don't have it all together. I think that's a very attractive thing, just in your leadership of who you are.
Well, let me throw something out. I'd like to pick your brains about something, because I see this from a little different perspective. I'm a child psychiatrist. I don't take care of grown-ups, but I end up getting involved when there is a challenge in the pastor's family. And that, oftentimes there are significant financial stressors that are associated, like when, if you've got a spouse or a child, like maybe struggling with some mental health issues. Like there was one pastor's family where I was working with them, they're spending $1,000 a month on medication, which, on a pastor's salary becomes like a very significant issue. Some guys don't have the best of healthcare benefits, so that there aren't necessarily like a ton of resources to be able to pay for certain kinds of help. One of the areas, we were talking about, it's great that John can kind of talk a little bit about the fact that he can openly say in a forum like this that he's been to see a counselor. But there is a tremendous amount of stigma still around this church when it comes to families. Like the most egregious situation I've been in was that there was a pediatrician who used to come to lectures that I was doing out of state regularly, had asked me to see their pastor, that this man and his wife, they had adopted a young boy who had been severely traumatized. And at age 5, when he punched the child of the man who was the chair of the elder board, he was fired because of, claiming that because he didn't have control over his own family, he was disqualified from the pastorate. There are a fair number of times where I have had Sunday evening appointments where pastors have parked behind our office building and we have snuck them in through a back door so that their car isn't seen in front of what's recognized as my office when they have like a family member in crisis. So, if you could talk a little bit from your perspective about, how this stuff affects families, and like what you do, like when you have colleagues who have these struggles, or, what are some of the things that that pastors can do, or where can they turn in situations where maybe they're not having the mental health struggle, but it's their spouse or their kid who's having the mental health struggle?
I'd love to hear what John has to say.
We're pastors, both of us. I know it. So the context I'm in has been the church is super generous. I don't think we have that stigma to the most part. Our church staff has just recently decided they are going to, anonymously, if any staff member needs care and wants to see a counselor, that the church is offering to pay for some of that, just because it's expensive, and medicines as well. That one of the things that I realized when I was young pastor is how hard the ministry can be on my spouse and kids. Now, I was a PK and I grew up as a pastor's kid, and I saw firsthand how hard it is for even just being a PK with a pastor's son. And my dad was great guy. It's just there's this expectation. There's this like you said, like you need to, you can't have any problems, or my dad's going to feel like he's not in control of his house. You can't be an elder or some sort of thing. And all I can say is if you're in a context where that is seen, I would probably start to find leadership, and I would take leadership out one-on-one, and I would start to get relationship. If I was in your shoes, let's say I was in a place where there was elders that were leaders of the church, and I didn't know if they knew anything about my past or what's going on with mental illness, I would get in relationship with them, and I would start to move slowly through the leadership that this is commonplace, that this is needed, that we need something in place. $1,000 for medicine for my children needs to be taken care of. And anyway, they church would probably do that if it was some sort of not mental illness type of medicine. They'd probably do it for something else. Cancer, they do it for cancer, I'm sure, if you did. But I think what I would do is I'd start small with the leaders to try and convince to move to pray, get a team of people to pray through and change minds in the leadership of this. I think that's the only way I could attack this. And it's hard though, because like you said, different people, different strokes, but I would probably start to have people read books, have resources like this, send articles, trying to get the mental awareness of what is really going on. It's not a moral issue. It could be a clinical issue. So that's probably where I would start. But if you're not in that context, like I'm in a great context where people are paying, it's really difficult to hold that ground for sure.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer because it's not been my experience of like, what do you do? I mean, the stories are absolutely heartbreaking. So maybe I can speak of maybe someone who's interested in church planting or starting something new and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I just think it's really important to talk with, make sure you're on the same page with your leaders, the people that might become elders, your key leadership, not just putting people who are maybe older or have money or have experience, but making sure they're on the same page. Not that you're going to agree with everything, but like make sure they love Jesus and they love you and you love them. And I think it's just really important in the beginning. In the beginning, you can be so desperate, at least in church planting, to anyone who wants to help, you just let them do it and you just let them be in charge. And you know there's some issues, but you're like, maybe we'll get to it down the road. Or I just say it's important to go slow and make sure you guys are on the same page and make sure you're giving leadership and authority away to people who understand this and understand that you're not perfect and they're not perfect. And so I just think in the beginning phase is not to rush through things and making sure that it's a good fit for the culture you want to create, because the leadership culture is going to affect the everyday, how the church goes. So I just think be very careful in the beginning as you kind of raise up leaders to make sure you guys are on the same page on these things.
Yeah, I heard Bob Goff say once that it's like relationships like this. You don't want to go too fast, too deep. It's like diving. If you go too fast, too deep, you'll get the bends. Mm-hmm. You got to do it in a progressive way to build that relationship and really see the character, especially in church planting. I agree with that, Dylan, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. Just love your perspectives. A little bit of a shift here as we're talking more directly again about the online pastors retreat. And please, we've got about 15 minutes till the top of the hour and the webinar is concluded. If you've got questions or comments, now is the time. So go ahead and leave those in the chat or on Facebook. But we have scheduled this retreat. It's a virtual event. There's going to be a series of videos that are released for the first time, over 3 days. But people are certainly not required to watch the videos immediately as soon as they're released. In fact, we're encouraging people through some communications that we're going to be sending out to those registered to make it work for you. So, if you were talking to a friend in ministry about this, Dylan, I'll start with you. What's an approach that could work for your schedule that you might recommend to a friend? Because, we're well aware that pastors don't have 3 days in a row to dedicate to this. It's right now, the timing is approaching about 15 hours of content total. So Dylan, what is an approach that you might recommend to a friend that works for you?
Yeah, so maybe this is a not an unpopular perspective on this. So I just challenge myself and other church planters and pastors that I help coach and train and talk through. I encourage them to view the word lazy or busy as synonymous with lazy. So if you're busy, I want you to think that you're being lazy. Now, of course, there are seasons where that's exceptions, like when the pandemic started, or if you're like a single parent, or if you got children who have special needs, so I want to yes, there are exceptions, but just a general rule, just assume that busyness equals laziness. And so what that means is if you're busy, it means you're not being proactive with your time. You don't have to work 80 hours a week. If you schedule out your days, however that works for you, plan it ahead of time, then you'll get through what you need to get through. We say we're busy, and then we can talk about the last 3 Netflix shows that we've binged, or you look at your iPhone, your screen time app, and you've been on your phone 2.5 hours that day. That's not busy. That's just, you're not being proactive. So I would recommend scheduling your days ahead of time. What does it look like for this? Putting it in your calendar. So most of these, I think around 20 to 30 minutes. So maybe three a week over your lunch break or something like that ahead of time. Like on Sunday, kind of plan out your week of when you're going to do this. I think, you might look at all, like you said, 15 hours worth of content or something like that. That's like a lot. I'm not going to be able to get through that. Well, maybe that if you look at it like that, but if you take small chunks at a time, that's what I would recommend, is being more proactive with your time and scheduling that ahead of time so that you can get through. Because this is important. I think stuff like this is hard because we don't see the return on it right away. And so like, it doesn't really matter. But success in ministry is not what you're going to do the next 3 years. It's the next 30 or 40 or 50 or, however much long you have in what you're doing. And so I'd say be proactive and put it in your calendar when you're going to watch it. And it's okay if you don't get it all done in the first 3 days. It's about going through the material in a way that's helpful for you.
John,
We're going to recommend, we're going to recommend that, that people even prioritize, when we publish a watch guide, which is going to be coming really soon, to prioritize, the content that you want to see, most, what's most meaningful to you. And, let's say that's all you can get to, over the course of a few weeks. Well, that is absolutely better than none of it. So, so sorry to interrupt, John. What are your thoughts?
I just want to clarify because I've never heard that before. So are you saying that the laziness is similar to busyness because you're not actually being proactive in boundary setting for your time? Is that so? If you're lazy in your boundary setting, then you're going to be busy. Is that kind of being proactive? Is what you said? Is that kind of
yes?
I just want
essentially,
to use your
yeah. That's been my experience. Is that we're busy because we're not proactive with our time. It's just like when you don't have a budget and you don't feel like you ever have any money. Well, it's not because you're not proactive with how you spend your money. So you feel like you don't have enough. You feel like you don't have enough time because you're not planning how you're going to spend your time.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I just wanted clarity. Thanks, man.
So what about for you, John? How would you recommend to, ministry friends, that might be a workable solution for them to consume the content?
Yeah, I think what happens too is accountability is really great. And so what I would recommend you do is you grab a couple people and say, hey, we're going to watch this together, like the care team, and just watch a few, because then you'll know you'll have to watch it with people because you can't escape out. And I think that's helpful also to build community, especially if do some of the topics. It might help change some minds of ministry leaders or people that have a stigma towards that. But I would, some of us do very well when we're in groups, the accountability of it, the people that, I don't want to let anybody down, so I want to do this thing. But if you set that up, that helps as well, for sure.
Excellent. Well, so we're getting close to the top of the hour here. So last call for comments or questions for John or Dylan. But John, if you would just, if you had just one thing as a takeaway for anybody who's watching this or anybody who's on the fence about whether or not they're going to sign up, what would you say to encourage them to participate in the online pastors retreat for themselves?
Here's what I'd say. I think that this year has probably been more stressful, more traumatic than you probably think. At least in how if you're like me and you have to retool your whole ministry, it's imperative that you think that maybe there's some stuff going on in my own heart that I'm not even aware of just because of what has happened the last 7-8 months and what's continually happening in our country. So I would just say, hey, what's the harm in setting aside some time just to be with the Spirit, be with God, be with Jesus, and have Him show you if this might be something that's going on in your heart. So I would just, the time of it, and the pride to know that maybe there's stuff that I need to deal with that I don't even know about.
Excellent. Dylan, what about you? What takeaway would you offer to a friend or ministry colleague who's kind of on the fence about whether or not to sign up for this?
Yeah, I think what John said is good, and I'm sure Steve has tons of experience. A lot of times the difficulties and the traumas that we're experiencing, we don't realize it till after the fact. And so instead of burning out next summer because you've been going 100 miles an hour and just be proactive with it. So we said, be proactive with your time, be proactive with how you're doing physically and emotionally and spiritually. I like this quote by Mark Sayers. He talks about this idea that personal renewal precedes corporate change. So I'm very much a doer, want to get stuff done, want our church to be doing things, want to make sure people are growing. But I need to make sure I'm growing. Am I loving Jesus more? Do I have habits that are growing my relationship with Jesus so that I'm healthy? And if I'm doing that, instead of focusing on all the things I need to do, I think other people by example will start to maybe adapt some of those practices. And so in the busyness, I don't like that word, and the a lot going on-ness, we'll say it that way, of this year and the craziness of it, if you're not doing well, you can't expect your church or your people to do well. Personal renewal precedes corporate change. And so if you want to see change and hope and growth, you got to make sure that you're on that path as well.
What are your thoughts, Steve? Any takeaways you'd like to offer those who are maybe watching this and thinking about participating?
Yeah, I mean, I have a slightly different one, and I guess it comes from, my perspective and like what I do for a living, that we've been focused a lot on, pastors and the whole notion of self-care. But there's an entire another section of like what we're doing that's focused on church care. Mm-hmm. And so that I've blown away by like some of the qualities of the resources that folks have developed, to help pastors and other ministry leaders do a better job of caring for people in their congregation who may have these struggles, and reaching out in particular to people who have these struggles and are outside of the church, who don't have that connection and don't know Jesus and don't have the support of a loving church family. And so that there are lots of resources there, for example, around people, and kids in particular who have mental health struggles. There's just some amazing research on the extent to which that prevents families from being a part of the church. So that, if you're doing okay and the staff people around you are doing okay, I can guarantee you that the people around you in the community you serve aren't doing okay, and that there'll be like lots of resources available, to help you think about, how folks with these struggles actually represent an opportunity for evangelism and outreach and sharing the gospel.
Yep. And to your point, Steve, just talking about, participating in something like this, not only for yourself, but to care more effectively, perhaps for the people who are already in your church and in your community. I mean, that goes right back to that quote that you said, Dylan, about personal renewal preceding corporate change. I mean, that's a great summation for exactly what we hope that this retreat can provide to many ministry leaders who participate. So, well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, and we just so appreciate your time. Pastor Dylan Dodson, Pastor John Meaux, and Dr. Steve Grcevich. Each of you has just provided incredible insight into the need and also the heart that we at Key Ministry have for not only serving the needs of children and families, but also those who are the shepherds, in care of our souls. So we encourage you, again, to just visit the Key Ministry website, keyministry.org. Just look across the top at the right, and it'll say Online Pastors Retreat. Take you right there. Registration is open now. You can give this retreat as a gift to your pastor, so we encourage you to do that. There's a link about midway down on the homepage. I encourage you also to check back in with us in the future. We have lots of events ongoing all the time, just like this. Visit keyministry.com to see any of our previous ministry webinars, or check us out on all of the major social media platforms. So for Key Ministry, I'm Catherine Boyle. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.